My name is Caroline Evans, and I was raised in a house where every inch seemed to echo with history and ambition. Growing up in Boston, Massachusetts, especially in our old red brick house perched on the edge of Beacon Hill, I learned early that my last name carried weight. The Evans family was renowned for its long line of lawyers, all of whom were fierce, polished, and relentless in their pursuit of success. Sometimes it felt like our home itself was watching over me, making sure I followed every expectation laid out for me by generations past. The oil portraits lining the staircase seemed to frown in disapproval whenever I lingered too long with my thoughts. My father, Richard Evans, was the kind of man people whispered about in the marble corridors of the courthouse. He ran Evans and Associates with an unshakable grip, a presence that filled every room he entered. He had a way of making decisions sound like laws that had already been passed. Even his laughter, deep and booming, felt like it had been rehearsed for a courtroom. My mother, Margaret, was softer in her speech but no less demanding in her expectations. She orchestrated charity galas from our parlor, making our home a revolving door for judges' wives, senators, and other families steeped in Boston society's traditions. When she wasn't planning events, she was attending them, always dressed in her pearls and cashmere, her approval doled out in small, precious doses. From the moment I was old enough to hold a pen, the path ahead of me was laid out: top grades, the right friends, and eventually Harvard Law, just as my father had done and his father before him. I was the only daughter, and with that came a unique blend of pride and pressure. I excelled in school, partly because it was expected and partly because I was terrified of letting anyone down. At home, dinner conversations revolved around landmark cases and legislative debates. Even as a child, I learned to listen, to ask the right questions, to give answers that made my father's eyes light up with approval. Sometimes I wondered if I was loved or simply admired. By the time I was finishing my undergraduate degree, there was never any question about my next step. I was accepted into Harvard Law, and my family celebrated with the kind of dinner usually reserved for judicial appointments. I remember my father's hand on my shoulder, heavy and warm, as he announced to the table that the Evans name would carry on. My mother just smiled, but I could see the relief in her eyes, as if a burden had finally been lifted. Law school was everything I had been prepared for: grueling, competitive, and relentless. I threw myself into my studies, but as the months passed, a kind of numbness began to settle over me. I sat in those grand lecture halls, surrounded by classmates who were as driven as I was, yet something inside me felt restless, out of place. My professors praised my essays, and my peers respected my opinions, but I started to feel like I was reciting someone else's script. It was during a seminar on environmental law that I first felt the stirrings of something different. The professor, Dr. Linda Barrett, spoke passionately about the future of renewable energy and the role lawyers could play in shaping environmental policy. Her words lingered with me long after class, but not for the reasons my father would have hoped. I found myself more drawn to the idea of building solutions rather than debating them in a courtroom. I started reading about solar technology, wind turbines, and sustainable design in my spare time. The more I learned, the more I realized how deeply I wanted to do something tangible, something that could directly change lives rather than just argue over the rules. Bringing this up at home was never easy. My father, for all his intelligence, had a certain rigidity when it came to tradition. At Sunday dinners, when I cautiously mentioned the need for innovation in sustainable energy, he would wave his hand and remind me that real power lay in the courtroom. The world changes in courtrooms and boardrooms, Caroline, not in garages or laboratories, he said once, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. My mother, for her part, just pursed her lips and changed the subject, asking if I'd decided which law journal to join. I quickly learned to keep my dreams to myself. Despite my family's certainty, my restlessness only grew. I found myself sneaking away from campus events to attend talks on technology and entrepreneurship. I'd sit in the back of crowded lecture halls, listening to speakers who had risked everything to build something new. I started taking notes, scribbling ideas in the margins of my casebooks, wondering what it would feel like to leap instead of following the script. My closest friend, Julia, who was finishing her engineering degree at MIT, became my confidant. We'd meet at a cramped coffee shop in Cambridge, where she'd show me prototypes she was working on, and I'd share my fears of letting everyone down. Looking back, I think I always knew I would have to choose between the life my parents wanted for me and the life I wanted for myself. The breaking point came one cold January morning. Snow had been falling all night, and the world outside was buried in white, silent and still. I sat in my bedroom, staring at the acceptance letter for a summer internship at my father's firm, and I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. I thought about the cases I'd be assigned, the partners I'd have to impress, the endless parade of cocktail parties and boardroom meetings. I thought about the years ahead, each one mapped out before me, each one a little less my own. Then I thought about the villages I'd read about, communities in America and Europe still struggling with unreliable power grids, kids doing homework by candlelight, and clinics unable to run basic equipment. I thought about the potential of solar power, the idea that I could help bring light, real, tangible light, into people's lives. It was a small dream, but it was mine. That morning, I made a decision. I would leave law school. I would walk away from the future my parents had so carefully constructed, and I would try, even if I failed, to build something new. I didn't tell my parents. I knew what the reaction would be. My father would call it a phase, my mother would be too hurt to speak, and both would remind me of everything I owed the Evans name. Instead, I called Julia. She didn't hesitate for a second. "Caroline, you only get one life," she said. "You might as well make it yours." I packed my things quietly, putting away textbooks I'd barely opened and folding suits I knew I'd never wear again. I left a short note for my roommate, letting her know I'd be gone for a few days, but I didn't mention my real plans. Julia picked me up in her old, dented Subaru, and we drove through the snowy streets of Cambridge, talking about everything and nothing. The world felt wide open, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As we crossed the Charles River, the city stretched out before me, all glittering lights and endless possibilities. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of expectation begin to lift. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew that whatever it was, it would be mine and mine alone. That was the day I quietly, irrevocably, began to rewrite my story. After closing the door on my family's expectations and the world of law, I stepped into a life that felt as small and uncertain as my new apartment in Somerville. My studio was hardly more than a glorified shoebox above a noisy pizzeria, with creaky floors, a window that overlooked the alley, and a radiator that made unsettling noises late at night. I had a mattress on the floor, a rickety desk from a thrift shop, and a tiny kitchenette that barely fit my battered coffee maker. Everything about my life now was temporary, fragile, and entirely my own. I remember standing in that space, my boxes stacked like barricades, wondering if I'd made a mistake I couldn't take back. The first few weeks passed in a blur of anxiety and coffee. My savings were laughably slim, just under $2,000 in my checking account, and every dollar seemed to vanish as soon as I spent it. I stretched my budget by living on instant ramen, black coffee, and the occasional slice of free pizza from the shop downstairs. Instead of networking events and lecture halls, I spent my nights huddled over my laptop, scrolling through forums on solar tech, scribbling half-baked ideas in my notebook, and emailing anyone who might give me advice. I felt free, but I was also terrified. During the day, I worked at a local tech startup on the edge of Kendall Square. The job was supposed to be temporary, just a way to pay my rent, but I soon found myself learning skills I'd never picked up at Harvard: troubleshooting code, pitching products, and convincing skeptical engineers that my ideas weren't entirely crazy. My boss, a wiry woman named Sophie with wild hair and relentless energy, seemed to exist on caffeine and stubbornness alone. I never told her my real ambitions, but something about her made me believe that building something new, against all odds, was possible. At night, the real work began. I named my company Sunbridge Solutions, a name that sounded grander than the reality of me working alone in my pajamas, surrounded by stacks of empty coffee cups. My vision was simple: to bring affordable solar infrastructure to the forgotten corners of America and Europe, places where power outages were a fact of life and renewable energy seemed like a distant dream. I didn't have the money, the experience, or even the connections, but I had an idea that I couldn't let go. It didn't take long to realize I needed help. That's when David came into the picture. He was my neighbor, a mechanical engineer with a mop of curly hair and a love for all things DIY. I first met him in the laundry room, where he was fixing the ancient dryer with parts scavenged from a broken toaster. We got to talking, and before I knew it, we were sketching solar panel layouts on the back of napkins and arguing about battery storage over cheap Chinese takeout. David became my co-conspirator, a partner who believed in the mission even when it was just the two of us against the world. Through David, I met Lisa, a marketing graduate from London who had landed in Boston for a year-long fellowship and decided never to leave. Lisa was the polar opposite of me: outgoing, quick with a joke, and fearless when it came to cold calling investors or charming journalists. I was always the quiet planner, but Lisa had a way of making me believe in the project when my doubts threatened to swallow me whole. Together, the three of us worked out of my apartment, our conference table, just a folding card table between the mattress and the radiator. We split our days between our real jobs and endless nights of brainstorming, grant writing, and prototype testing. Money was always tight. Every dollar we made from part-time gigs went back into Sunbridge Solutions. I learned to stretch every cent, shopping for parts at hardware store sales, scouring Craigslist for used equipment, and borrowing tools from neighbors. Our prototype panels were built from scratch in David's uncle's garage. I knew we couldn't survive on hope alone, so I started entering local pitch competitions, practicing my story until I could recite it in my sleep. The day I won our first $5,000 at a Cambridge entrepreneurship event, I almost fainted with relief. It was just enough to cover parts, a website, and a handful of marketing flyers. Despite the progress, I kept my double life a secret from my family. I lied on the phone, telling my mother about fictional law school exams and made-up study groups, all the while listening to my father's lectures about firm politics and family pride. I missed birthdays, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, claiming I was buried in work. Each excuse felt like another stone in the wall between us. Sometimes I wondered if they could hear the guilt in my voice. I tried to convince myself it was temporary, just until the company got off the ground, but the ache of their absence followed me everywhere. There were moments when I nearly gave up. Sometimes, after a long day at the startup and a longer night with Sunbridge Solutions, I would stare at our numbers and wonder if we were chasing an impossible dream. We hit setback after setback, broken panels, failed grant applications, meetings that went nowhere. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered why I started. I remembered the articles I'd read about communities in Maine or small towns in Vermont where families couldn't depend on the grid, where one storm could plunge everyone into darkness. I remembered the feeling of powerlessness I'd felt back in Boston, trying to live someone else's life. If nothing else, I told myself, I wanted to give others a shot at something better. Our breakthrough came sooner than any of us expected. David found an article about a fishing village on the coast of Maine that had lost power after a nor'easter. The local schoolhouse had become a shelter, but they were running on diesel generators and running out of fuel. We pooled every dollar we had left, loaded up David's beat-up Honda, and drove north in the middle of a snowstorm. When we arrived, the town was dark except for a handful of flickering candles in windows. The principal, a woman named Ellen, listened to our pitch with skepticism but agreed to let us try. We spent the next 3 days sleeping on classroom floors, wiring panels, and hoping nothing would catch fire. When the lights finally flickered on in that old schoolhouse, I stood in the hallway and cried. I watched children run through the halls, their faces glowing in the new electric light. Parents hugged each other in relief, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my choices lift, replaced by a pride that was entirely my own. Word spread quickly. The local paper ran a story about Sunbridge Solutions, calling us the team of young dreamers who brought light to the coast. Within a week, my inbox was flooded with messages from other towns in Maine, and even a mayor from Vermont. I got a call from a small community in rural France, and Lisa's connections brought interest from a group in Scotland. We were suddenly in demand, scrambling to keep up with requests we'd once only dreamed of receiving. Yet, even as the company started to grow, my personal life felt more complicated than ever. At home, my father talked endlessly about courtroom victories and the future of Evans and Associates, never once asking what I was up to. My mother's calls grew shorter and less frequent, her voice strained and distant. I sensed their disappointment, even though they didn't know the full truth. I wanted to tell them about the schoolhouse in Maine, the families in Vermont, the growing list of projects in Europe. I wanted them to see the person I was becoming. But every time I tried, the words caught in my throat, and I resorted to safe topics: the weather, my classes, their social plans. The loneliness of living in the shadows weighed on me. I watched friends from law school post photos of graduations, clerkships, and celebrations I would never attend. I wondered what it would feel like to be welcomed home as a hero, instead of hiding my victories in a studio apartment above a pizza shop. But when I won a $1 million grant from a major tech foundation in New York, an email that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped my phone, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I let myself dream about a future where I could be honest, where my parents could see not just the daughter they wanted, but the woman I was becoming. Still, I kept my secret. I wasn't ready for the confrontation, or for the possibility that they would never understand. So I celebrated with David and Lisa, the three of us toasting with cheap wine as the city lights shimmered outside my window. In that moment, I knew we were building something real. Something worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every shadow I still had to walk through. Christmas in the Evans household had always been a display of tradition and status, but that particular year, the festivities felt especially suffocating. My parents' house on Beacon Hill gleamed with holiday lights wound tightly around the wrought iron banisters and candles flickering in the tall windows. The grand foyer smelled of pine needles and cinnamon, and a live pianist played carols softly in the corner, setting a tone that was equal parts festive and formal. Each year, my mother outdid herself: polished silver, heirloom china, bouquets of winter roses, because Christmas Eve wasn't just a family gathering, but the social event of the season for Boston's legal elite. I arrived carrying a weight heavier than any gift. The ride over from Somerville was tense, the city streets glistening with slush and reflecting the red and green glow of traffic lights. I wore a simple navy dress and an old wool coat, hoping I looked presentable enough, but feeling every bit the outsider. I tried to steady my nerves, clutching the bottle of wine I'd brought as a peace offering, all the while rehearsing excuses in my head for another year of secrets. The house was already buzzing with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Old family friends mingled in the parlor, partners from Evans and Associates lingered by the fireplace, and my younger brother, Henry, home from his first semester at Yale, was in the kitchen raiding the cheese platter. As I stepped through the door, my mother swept toward me in a sea of emerald velvet and pearls, her arms outstretched and her smile fixed in place. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, already fussing over my coat and hair, and then ushered me into the crowd, making polite introductions to people whose faces I'd seen at every holiday for as long as I could remember. My father stood near the bay window, holding court with a circle of his colleagues, his laugh booming over the music. His presence, as always, commanded the room. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mixture of pride and scrutiny. I braced myself, waiting for his inevitable questions about law school and career plans. Instead, he hugged me, a gesture more formal than affectionate, and introduced me to Judge Hastings, an old friend of the family who'd presided over several high-profile cases with my father. I answered questions on autopilot, careful to keep my stories straight, telling half-truths about law school papers and the internship that didn't exist. I could feel the strain behind my words, the persistent knot in my stomach tightening with every conversation. All around me, the talk was of court victories, campaign fundraisers, and new appointments to state boards. No one asked about solar panels or rural schools, and the only mention of renewable energy was as a punchline to a joke about hippie startups in California. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the table set with the good silver and tall crystal glasses. I found myself seated between my father and Henry, with my mother directly across from me. Conversation ebbed and flowed. Henry told stories about Yale, my father recounted the firm's recent successes, and my mother passed dishes with practiced grace. I smiled and nodded, trying to eat, my appetite buried beneath the dread that something, anything, could give me away. It was after the second course, as the plates were being cleared and the candles flickered low, that the conversation circled back to me. My father turned to me, his voice carrying easily down the table. "So, Caroline," he said, smiling, "how are classes? Which firm are you planning to clerk with this summer? I heard from your old professor last week, he had only the highest praise." I froze. For a split second, I considered lying, playing along for another year. But the strain of double lives, the loneliness of hiding my work, and the hollow pride I saw in my father's eyes, all of it crashed down at once. I looked at the faces around me, my brother, full of hope and curiosity, my mother, waiting for the right answer, and my father, expecting only affirmation of the family's legacy. Something inside me snapped, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I was tired of pretending, tired of carrying the weight alone. I set down my fork and cleared my throat. The table quieted, forks poised in midair. I tried to steady my voice, which trembled despite my best efforts. "Dad, I'm not going back to law school," I began. "I left last year." For a moment, no one seemed to understand. My mother's eyes widened, Henry's fork clattered onto his plate, and my father's face turned slowly from confusion to disbelief. Before he could interrupt, I pressed on, the words tumbling out faster now. "I started my own company. It's called Sunbridge Solutions. We build solar infrastructure for towns and communities that don't have reliable electricity. We started small, just me and a couple of friends, but now we're providing power to families in Maine, Vermont, even parts of rural France and Scotland. We've won grants, partnered with schools, and changed lives." My voice caught, emotion tightening my throat. I did all of this because it mattered to me, because I wanted to make a difference, not just in a courtroom, but in the real world. The silence was complete. Even the pianist seemed to sense the shift and slowed to a halt. For a moment, all I heard was the clink of glass and the faint sound of snow tapping against the windows. Then my mother's face crumpled. She pressed her napkin to her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. My father's face reddened, jaw set in a way I'd only seen during his most difficult trials. "How could you?" His voice was low but carried an edge sharper than any I'd heard before. "You threw away everything we built for you. Your name, your education, the future we gave you." He looked at me as if I were a stranger. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Evans family is built on reputation, on tradition. You risked it all for," he waved his hand dismissively. "Solar panels? Charity work? You could have been anything." I tried to hold his gaze, but my resolve wavered. "Dad, it isn't just charity. It's a business, a successful one. We've helped hundreds of families. I've built something real. He cut me off, voice rising. What about our name? Our legacy? You think your little project can compare to that? You embarrassed us, lied to us, and for what? Some fleeting dream? He looked away, as if the sight of me was too much to bear. If you can't respect what this family stands for, then maybe you don't belong in this house. I looked to my mother, hoping for a sign of understanding, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, hands trembling in her lap. Henry reached out, wanting to comfort me, but my father's glare stopped him cold. I knew then that there was nothing left to say. I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood, and tried not to cry. I walked out of the dining room, past the portraits of ancestors who'd never know my name, and up to my old bedroom. I packed a small bag, hands shaking as I stuffed a few clothes and my laptop inside. I left the bottle of wine unopened on my desk. A silent farewell to Julia, ever my lifeline, was waiting outside in her battered old Volkswagen. The snow was falling, thick and fast, and the city looked softer under its quiet blanket. I slid into the passenger seat, letting the tears fall freely now, and Julia squeezed my hand without saying a word. As she drove me away from Beacon Hill, the lights of my childhood home faded behind us, and for the first time, I felt both loss and relief. That night, as we crossed the Charles River, I realized I had finally told my truth. I had risked everything for the life I wanted, not the one my family demanded. The pain of rejection burned, but underneath it, a flicker of freedom began to grow. My secret was out. The path forward was uncertain, but at least now it belonged to me. Moving to Newport, Rhode Island, was more than a change of address. It was the first act of true independence I had ever taken. My grant money had arrived in a single wire transfer, an almost surreal sum that finally gave me the freedom to leave behind the shadows of Boston and the small apartment in Somerville. I toured a handful of places on the windswept coast, but the house I chose was nothing like my family's grand, tradition-steeped mansion on Beacon Hill. This home was small, a two-story shingled cottage with salt on its windows and a porch that seemed to reach out over the Atlantic itself. I fell in love with its simplicity: faded hardwood floors, sun-bleached walls, and a view of the water that made every sunrise feel like a promise kept. Each morning, I woke before dawn, padded barefoot into the kitchen, and brewed a pot of strong coffee. I would step outside onto the porch, mug in hand, and watch the pale golden pink streaks stretch across the sky. The waves crashed against the rocks in a constant, soothing rhythm, and I felt, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be at peace with my choices. Newport itself was a quieter place than Boston, but the community was lively, full of artists, fishermen, and people who understood what it meant to start again. I fit right in, not because of my last name, but because of the work I did and the hope I carried. With a real office set up in my sunlit living room, Sunbridge Solutions entered a new era. Gone were the days of huddling around a card table in Somerville, holding our breath with every grant application and prototype. Now, our work felt bigger, urgent and real. We built partnerships with town managers across the Midwest, bringing solar microgrids to farming communities in Iowa and Nebraska. I hired a small team of engineers and outreach coordinators, each one hungry to make a difference, many of them young women who reminded me of myself just a few years earlier. Lisa took charge of our European expansion, splitting her time between London and the French countryside. She sent postcards and emails, full of stories about the people we were helping: a bakery in Normandy that no longer lost power during storms, a rural school in Scotland with heat and light all winter long. David, ever the inventor, spent weeks at a time on the road, tinkering with new battery systems in barns, school basements, and the garages of clients who soon became friends. I sometimes marveled at how far we had come, how the kernel of an idea had grown into a company serving hundreds of communities on both sides of the Atlantic. By the time our third year rolled around, Sunbridge Solutions had become more than a startup. It was a name people in the world of renewable energy started to recognize. We won a contract to retrofit solar panels in a network of hospitals in rural Vermont and received a profile in a national business magazine, featuring a photograph of me standing on the porch of my Newport home, the ocean stretching endlessly behind me. I read the article twice, hardly able to believe it was my story. My phone rang nonstop for days, as other companies, potential investors, and even university professors reached out, eager to collaborate or learn from our experience. Then came the letter from Washington, D.C., an invitation to serve as an advisor to the United States Department of Energy's Sustainability Council. At first, I thought it was a mistake or some kind of joke. I read the message 3 times before it sank in. They wanted my perspective, my input on the national stage. It was a seat at the table I never thought I'd be invited to, and for a moment, I was overcome with gratitude for every risk I had taken, every lonely night spent believing in a future that no one else could see. My work on the council was both exhilarating and humbling. I commuted to Washington every month, joining meetings filled with experts and policymakers, and learned how to argue for real change among people who could make it happen. Sometimes, I would look around the table and remember those dinners back on Beacon Hill, my father lecturing on legal precedent while I stayed quiet. Now, my voice carried weight. I wasn't just seen, I was heard, respected, and valued for exactly who I was. There was an irony to my new life that I couldn't ignore. Not long after joining the council, I learned that the Evans family law firm, Evans and Associates, was facing a major environmental compliance case. They had taken on a corporate client in trouble over outdated power systems and pollution violations. The client, to turn things around, applied for federal sustainability grants and regulatory leniency, exactly the kind of issues our council was created to oversee. It took only a moment of reading through the proposals to see the familiar letterhead. And my father's signature beneath a long legal argument. No one at the law firm knew I was there. The proposal was reviewed like any other, judged on its merits and its potential to do good. I felt a pang of complicated sadness reading my family's words, realizing that even as they had rejected my path, their work now relied on the very world I had helped shape. I did not let the knowledge change my judgment. If anything, I was more rigorous, determined that my integrity would be above reproach. Even when my family's name appeared before me, that moment crystallized the strange, beautiful reality of my journey. While my parents had turned their backs on me, the world had turned toward me, ready to listen and learn. The legacy I had feared losing was not the one they tried to hand me, but the one I had painstakingly built with every late night, every dollar raised, and every community powered up. There were days, especially in winter, when the wind off the Atlantic cut straight through my jacket and the house creaked in protest, that I found myself looking back. Sometimes I would remember the Evans house in Boston, the feel of the heavy front door, the sound of my father's laughter echoing down the marble hall, my mother's soft voice calling me in for supper. I wondered, in those moments, if they ever read about Sunbridge Solutions in the news, if they ever saw my name on a panel or watched one of my interviews. I wondered if they missed me, or if they still believed that I had betrayed their trust, traded legacy for a whim. But more often, I thought of the children in Maine who could finish their homework after sunset, the bakery in Normandy that opened its doors to the whole village after a storm, the elderly couple in Nebraska who no longer worried about the cost of heat in the winter. Their letters and emails filled me with purpose. I kept a box of thank you notes on my kitchen table, rereading them when doubts crept in. My work was not about proving anything to my family. It was about the people who depended on us, who trusted us, who were finally seen. Lisa visited often, sometimes staying for weeks. We'd walk along the rocky shoreline, swapping stories and plotting new expansion plans. David would call from some rural town, excited about a new technical breakthrough, his laughter as bright as the morning sun. Our team grew, not just in numbers, but in spirit, every person drawn to the same sense of mission and possibility that had first set me on this path. When I received an invitation to speak at a global conference in London, I nearly said no. Public speaking had always terrified me, but Lisa insisted it was time to own the story, my story. I stood on stage before hundreds of strangers, looking out at the faces of engineers, scientists, and dreamers from around the world. I spoke about risk, about starting over, about the quiet courage it takes to defy expectations and listen to your voice. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but what mattered most was the small line of young women who waited afterward to tell me that my journey had helped them see a future for themselves. Too, standing by the ocean at the end of each day, I watched the horizon stretch toward Europe, and I understood something I never had in Boston. My story was not one of rebellion, but of creation. I had not abandoned a legacy, I had built my own, light by light, community by community, dollar by hard-earned dollar. My family's silence was still a wound, but it no longer defined me. The world was wide, the possibilities endless, and for the first time, I belonged completely to myself.